look at us starting right on time. Welcome to the Alice Mackay Room. My name's Jorge Amigo. I'm the head of cultural programming here at Vancouver Public Library. Thank you for spending such a beautiful, sunny afternoon here with us at the library. You are at the very last Incite event of the year. Give yourself a round of applause for that. Thank you. And a second round of applause for the Vancouver Writers Fest for this partnership and bringing amazing authors to the stage. So I want to remind us that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. If you've been here for the last 5 months, you've probably heard me here say that, talk about how many calls to action we have completed or not completed, which tends to be a very somber way to start an event. So for this last event, instead, I want to remind you that June is National Indigenous History Month. And since we're all here gathered because we care about the power of stories, I want to encourage you to seek out Indigenous literature, nonfiction, films, books, and all kinds of events that are happening in the city next month. The library is hosting a lot of events. We have a landing page for it if you want to go check out what we're doing. One thing that I'll plug is that we're hosting 2 screenings of an award-winning documentary called Twice Colonized. It's an Inuit story. So if you want to learn more about those, go to the website or talk to me after the event. I also want to plug one thing that's happening tomorrow on this stage at 7 p.m. as well. It's Danny Ramadan, Syrian refugee story. He is going to present his memoir at 7 p.m. right here tomorrow, so come to that as well. All right, let's get into some quick housekeeping and let's get this show started. Show on the road, is that the expression? So the first show, first of all, who is here for the first time ever? Okay, great, awesome, always great to have new people. Who has been here to more than 2 Incite events? All right, more than 3? All of them? Of course. Leslie never got sick, apparently, this whole 6 months. Awesome. So before I pass it on to Leslie, I have a few reminders for you. So if you need to exit at any point, please use the doors in the back where James is there. It's less disruptive because they're less noisy than these ones. The washrooms are located right outside this room to the right. If you need to drink water or fill up your water bottle, there's a new water fountain over there, so you don't have to go all the way to the bathroom and miss what's happening here. And then, super important, cell phones. We have these things in our pockets that create symphonies that are very distracting, so please turn them off. Or keep them on so you can take pictures, but mute them. And now, it's my pleasure to pass the torch to Leslie Herdig, who is the artistic director of the Vancouver Writers Fest.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight, our last Incite of 2024. I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it's almost June. Hello to all of you watching from home also. It is a delight to share this evening with you. We are so happy to be able to close out our 2024 season by co-presenting this event tonight with the BC and Yukon Book Prizes, a really important organization in our province and territory, which helps to highlight all of the incredible publishers and authors that we have in this province of ours. And the BC and Yukon Book Prizes does a lot of work year-round to host authors in classrooms, both digitally and I believe in person as well as hosting events throughout the province and then partnering with organizations like ours here tonight, and I think Word Vancouver as well later in the year. So do check out their website to see what sort of things they've got coming up. But right now what we're doing is celebrating some of the shortlisted authors for the prize this year. And those authors we have joining us tonight are Henry Tsang, nominated for the Bill Duthie's Bookseller Choice Award for his book White Riot, the 1907 anti-Asian riots in Vancouver. We have Samantha Nock, who is nominated for the Dorothy Livesay Poetry Prize for A Family of Dreamers, and Brandon Reid, who is nominated for the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize for his book Beautiful, Beautiful. Tonight we are as grateful as ever to the Vancouver Public Library for providing this space and for the partnership Incite over the past several months. And we also would like to thank our government sponsors, which include the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Government, the BC Arts Council, and the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island, which gives us a home and our office on Granville Island. We really could not do this work without our funders, and we are very grateful. We are also very grateful to our official bookseller, Black Bond Book Warehouse, who is here this evening selling the books of our 3 authors. So we hope you will go visit Caitlin at the end of this event and buy some of these books and have them signed. They make great gifts as well. And just one last reminder about our programming. We only have one more event left before the fall, and that is a special event with Ali Velshi, MSNBC's journalist correspondent, Ali Velshi. That will be at the Waterfront Theatre on June 27th, and tickets for that are on sale now. And then we're in the fall, and we have a lot of exciting special events coming up, and our flagship festival runs from October the 21st until the 27th. Tickets will go on sale the first week of September. We hope you'll find our program guide floating around Vancouver starting in, late August. You'll start finding it. So, on to the event here this evening. I'm going to introduce Megan Cole, and then I believe Megan is going to introduce our authors this evening. Megan is a journalist and author of creative nonfiction, which has appeared in The Puritan, Invisiblog, Untethered, and Hungry Zine. She is at work on her first narrative nonfiction book, which I love the title, by the way, Nice Boys Don't Kiss Like That. Womanhood explored through 90s rom-coms, MSN Messenger, and First Loves. When Megan isn't writing, reading, knitting, or cooking, she's working as the Director of Programming and Communications for the BC and Yukon Book Prizes. She lives and works on the territory of the Tla'amin Nation in British Columbia. Please welcome Megan.
Don't be afraid. Sure. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you so much to the Vancouver Public Library. This is our 4th year working with Incite. The first year I did this on Zoom. I'm much happier doing this in person, but I'm so thankful that we can live stream this because we do work with communities all over the province and territory, so it's lovely for us to be able to share this virtually as well. I'm not going to talk too much because I want to give these lovely people time to talk. Leslie and I kind of worked on this as the shortlists were coming out, and I think maybe when I picked these 3 authors, it was like, what do they have in common? And I said, we're going to talk about place. And Leslie said, sure, if you can do that, we're going to do it. Watch. Because I think all of you talk about place so beautifully and in different ways, and I think we're going to see that come together as you share your work. So we're going to start with Henry Tsang. Henry is an artist who explores the spatial politics of history, language, community, food, and cultural translation in relationship to place. His artworks take the form of gallery exhibitions, a 360-degree video, walking tours, curated dinners, and public art. Henry teaches at Emily Carr University of Art and Design here in Vancouver. Will you start us off, Henry?
Yeah, sure. This is the scary part. Oh, he didn't make a noise. Okay, great. Hello. Thanks for coming tonight. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Jorge, Vancouver Public Library. Also like to acknowledge that we are here on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My name is Henry Tsang, as Megan and Leslie and Jorge have said. This is a book that I worked on that came out last spring called White Riot. Well, you can read the subtitle. No, actually, I don't know if you can. The 1907 Anti-Asian Riots in Vancouver. I was quite tickled that I'm part of a series called Incite, because of the word riot connecting to insight is humorous hopefully not alarming. It depends on where you are at the time, I suppose, of a riot, and whether or not you're the target or you're the rioter. So this book is based on a 360 video walking tour called 360 Riot Walk, and that project traces the history and root of the mob that attacked the Chinese Canadian and the Japanese Canadian communities following the demonstration and parade organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League in Vancouver. Participants are led into the social and political environment of the time, where racialized communities were targeted through legislated acts, as well as physical acts of exclusion and violence. The interactive tour can be accessed on any web browser via 360riotwalk.ca, on location with a mobile device, such as a smartphone or a tablet, or remotely on a computer. The soundtrack is available in 4 languages spoken by the local residents at the time: English, Cantonese, Japanese, and Punjabi. Each voiceover includes an introduction in Squamish Snitcham, which is a Squamish language, one of the 2 indigenous languages of the area, the other being Hunkaminam. I tried to get Hunkaminam, but couldn't find a translator who had the time and capacity. Everyone's just so fully stretched. It's a great time to be a translator if you know Hunkaminam or Squamish Snitcham. Just putting it out there. And as the events occurred on the unceded land of the local 3 nations, 360 Riot Walk is a documentary, a mapping project, and an artwork. As a documentary, it tells a story not only of the 1907 riots, but also of the rise of anti-Asian sentiment that preceded it and the aftermath of subsequent restrictions against Asian immigration that were enacted. As a mapping project, it traces the founding of the Asiatic Exclusion League's Vancouver chapter. The original first founding of the Asiatic Exclusion League was in San Francisco a couple of years before, and how its racist histrionics incited an angry white mob to riot in Chinatown and Powell Street for almost 2 days. As an artwork, it is an immersive video that employs cutting-edge technology, I guess cutting edge within the last 20 years, right? Albeit with a lo-fi approach, akin to a site-specific interactive slideshow, accompanied by a voiceover with the imagery responding to your body's movements. And here's an excerpt from the tour, simulating how a viewer might navigate the 360 imagery, whether on their mobile device or on their computer at home.
In 1907, the Vancouver Trades and Labor Council, a conservative labor organization, founded its own chapter of the Asiatic Exclusion League. They advocated for a white man's country and the prohibition of Asian labor, to be achieved through legislation and violence if necessary. The Asiatic Exclusion League immediately organized its first event, a public demonstration on Saturday, September 7th, followed by a parade and speeches at City Hall. Estimates range from 25,000 to 30,000, over a third of the population at the time. An angry mob formed, marching down DuPont, now Pender Street, towards Chinatown. This was the entrance to Chinatown, into which the mob swarmed. Local residents on the street were caught by surprise and ran into the nearest building for cover. The rioters identified which businesses were run by Chinese and smashed their windows and vandalized their buildings. When the mob entered Chinatown, the Chinese people were initially taken by surprise. However, they soon began to organize and fight back. The police force had called in all of their off-duty officers, totaling about 24. Badly outnumbered, they were unable to have any effect, and their safety was often in doubt. The local English-language press blamed American labor leaders for inciting the riot. The Chinese-language press placed the blame squarely on local white unions, most of which were involved in anti-Asian activism and provocation. This is Shanghai Alley, which with adjacent Canton Alley was the economic and cultural center of the early Chinese community. On Monday morning, the Daily Province newspaper reported, "The Chinese armed themselves as soon as the gun stores opened. Hundreds of revolvers and thousands of rounds of ammunition were sold before the police stepped in and requested that no further sale be made to Asians."
So that was a highly edited, very selected synopsis of 3 different stops on the 13 stop tour. The total running time for all the audio across the 13 stops is about 42 minutes. So that's just kind of like a super condensed Coles Notes. So White Riot is a continuation of the journey that the walking tour has taken, circling back to the original English script, co-written by Michael Barnholden and myself, which is the centerpiece of the book. The voiceover you just heard is Michael Barnholden's voice. He's been giving these tours, walking tours of the riots, I guess for a couple of decades now. He wrote a book called Reading the Riot Act, A Brief History of Riots in Vancouver, that came out, I think, about 20 years ago or so. The library has a few copies. He's a local poet and writer, although he's hardly in town anymore. And there are visual excerpts of the panoramic photographs from each of the 13 tour stops, archival images, and documents embedded into the 360 photographs and photo documentation of guided tours. I've included a reflective essay chronicling the process and challenges of the making of the artwork, as well as other projects that preceded and informed it. Perhaps most significant are the essays by contributing writers, which provide a more detailed contextualization of some issues of the time and their impact on our lives today. I'm honored that historian Patricia Roy has provided the foreword to the book. Her White Man's Province from 1989, with its insightful and incisive investigation into the propagation of racist attitudes and exclusionary practices and policies, has been an influential text for me ever since I began researching what it means to be Chinese in this place that I'm privileged to call home. And in their essay, Uprooting the Racism in Our Ranks, Reflections from a Labor Perspective, Asian Canadian Labor Alliance members Stephanie Fung, Anna Liu, Karine Ng, and Chris Ramsarup provide a contemporary perspective on anti-Asian violence in Canada, which has increased significantly since COVID, since the pandemic, and calls out for organized labor to confront and stop the spreading of hate. Angela May and Nicole Yakashiro's Why We Say Powell Street and Not Japantown considers the politics of place and the power of names in Vancouver's Powell Street neighborhood, Powder Guy, and how a name like Japantown can ironically precipitate displacement in the very neighborhood from which Japanese Canadians were forcibly removed during the Second World War. Paul Engelsberg's The Bellingham Riot focuses on the agitation and violence against South Asians in the Washington State mill town that took place 3 days prior to Vancouver's own riot, and how widespread such attacks were along the West Coast in 1907. Melody Ma's A Changing Chinatown on Gentrification and Resilience explores the history of Vancouver's historic Chinatown, its roots in anti-Chinese exclusion, and the present-day threat of gentrification that is eroding the neighborhood's cultural identity. Andy Ann's Census Making and City Building, Data Perspectives on the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots and the Development of Vancouver, looks at how the census was used not as a neutral tool of quantitative measurement, but as a socially constructed measure that reflected the ideas and values of the tool makers. He posits that the census was, and still is, a contested space used to determine who is and who is not considered a Canadian and who belongs to the city. And Jeff Masuda, Aaron Franks, Audrey Kobayashi, Trevor Weidman, and the Right to Remain research collectives and urban rights praxis of remaining in Vancouver's downtown east side examines 150 years of colonial policies of racial containment in Vancouver's downtown east side through their research project, which involves past and present members of this community voicing their experiences in the pursuit of resistance to those very policies. I am indebted to the contributing writers for their patience and openness throughout the editorial process. The wealth and depth of their knowledge and lived experience is evident in the writings they have created for this publication. So back to 360 Riot Walk, the artwork that the book is based on. It was launched back in 2019 in the summer at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Chinese Garden, which was the project's lead collaborator and host. The following year, in 2020, the 360 tour was significantly revised and upgraded with visual elements and a new website with updated instructional videos, commissioned writings, and additional resources. In 2021, the Powell Street Festival, which is a local Japanese-Canadian arts and cultural festival, and it's free, BC Day long weekend, go check it out, it's fantastic, took on stewardship of the guided tours, for which I am grateful, as they are the ideal partner given their ongoing commitment to the downtown east side community and has been consistently progressive and, perhaps most importantly, courageously and radically inclusive. Just end up with this final image. It's a limited edition artist book that the Special Collections in the library has purchased. So if you are willing to put on cloth gloves, you can take a look at it upstairs. Yeah, and that's that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Henry. I've had the pleasure of sitting virtually, I will say, with Henry as he's presented to students in Victoria and Castlegar, sharing his book, and it's I've read it and I've interviewed him for our podcast, and I think it's just such an important book because it brings up topics that I think, even for me, I don't live in Vancouver anymore, but the topics of naming and gentrification and the stories of the land we live on that have been long ignored are important. And so I would really encourage you to go to the Powell Street Festival, first of all, and do the tour, and also pick up the book too and enjoy those essays. All right, next is Samantha Nock. Samantha is a Cree Métis writer and poet originally from Treaty 8 territory in the Peace region of northeast British Columbia. Her family is originally from Île-à-la-Croix, Saskatchewan. Samantha currently resides in unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands in so-called Vancouver. She has published works in Maisonneuve, Vice, Prism International, and Best Canadian Poetry, among others. Will you share a family of dreamers with us?
I'm going to stay right here.
Yes, please do.
I don't have a PowerPoint. I do like making them, though. Canva has been a revolution. Tansei Sam Nitsi Kesan Dawson Creek Otsinia Magamafemi Sigirawak Otsinianan Kananasko Mitanawa Maskuya Maski Squamish Eski Egwa Silitutaski Kananasko Mitanawa Kakyao. So, hi, I'm Sam. I am woefully unprepared, as I usually am. Just ask Megan about when I did a class presentation to a grade 10 English course in Whitehorse yesterday, and I thought, I can just come in and charm these 15-year-olds. No. I was humbled, which is important, which I think is why youth are here, because they're special, and they also humble you so much. I'm here to share some works out of my first debut poetry book, A Family of Dreamers, which came out in the fall with Talon Books. It is a collection of poems that I wrote, oh boy, throughout my, we'll say, messy 20s. I moved to Vancouver when I was 18 to go to UBC, showed up, never lived in a city. The biggest place I lived in was like literally Dawson Creek. Never been to Vancouver, showed up 2 garbage bags, and the coast hasn't gotten rid of me yet. But a lot of this book is also about grief, the grief of leaving home and moving to a new place and trying to fit in, and the grief of losing loved ones, and collective grief, and how we hold collective grief in our bodies and for our communities. All right. I was gonna ask you, I'm like, where should I start? My brain is half functioning from today, so I'm gonna start holding and flipping pages. This is also humbling. Has anyone been to the BC Peace region? Yeah, awesome. So a few of you, cool. So the first poem I'm gonna read is called Dawson Creek. Right to the point. I never know. Sitting down feels so casual. Nice. Oh God, no. Sitting's good. All right. So Dawson Creek. I was born in your small hospital, returned to your flat, dusty streets in adolescence. I've written and deleted so many lines of poetry for you. You are the first place I loved and left. So the Peace region is called the Peace region because of the Peace River, and a tributary to the Peace is this river called the Kiskatna, which is also the river that provides water for Dawson Creek, and it's a very storied place. I have a lot of family history at that place, and I would say that she's a main character in my life. But I'm going to read this first. I'm going to read this poem called Kiskatna Interlude, Part 1, and it's dedicated to the Kiskatna River and all the stories she holds. If you use the palms of your hands to caress the muddy banks of the Kiskatna, let your fingers slip through her silt. That is what I imagine it feels like to hold me. This is what it feels like to be there and not at the same time. The Kiskatna looks like she runs slow, eases around river bends, has shallow, warm pools that will hold your body. Kiskatna means cup bank in my language. It means get too close to the edge and you'll fall in. I wonder what it feels like to be both a mighty and tender thing. The river never has to apologize for the space she takes up. Wide shores hold life. Deep water cuts away at rock. She pulls you into her arms by their roots. She pulls trees into her arms by their roots. She is so gentle in parts and so vicious in others, and she'll bring you down into her depths. I'm not wearing my glasses, so I'm like aging. Outside of Dawson Creek, there's this little wonderful, beautiful place called Fellers Heights, where my grandparents live, where my dad lives, and my aunt and uncle, and it's just a magical place. And there we called my grandma and grandpa, who live out there, grandma and grandpa on the farm, because they lived on a farm. We were very creative people. But the farm is, and still is, a beautiful, safe place for me. And so this poem is called On the Farm. On the farm, I am free. Crabgrass brushes against my knuckles. Cold pond water runs through my fingers. A make-believe world between spruce trees. This is where I begin again and again and again. Tell me a story. Let's play Pictionary. Let's drink one more cup of coffee. I would give everything for just one more cup of coffee with you. You're all so quiet. That's okay. So I feel like I'm like going like an auctioneer. I'm gonna sell you a cow. My Vyvanse is wearing off, so I'm just trying to keep myself contained right now. So a little bit north of Dawson Creek is another place called Fort St. John, which is I consider Fort St. John my other hometown. It's where my cookum and my auntie and so much family lives. And so there's a poem for Fort St. John. And then I think after this, I just have 2 more. I have no idea how much more time I have. Fort St. John. I remember when there used to be nothing but flat fields in front of my elementary school. Behind Cookum's house, I play pretend in the backyard, climb on the railing of the porch and talk to the ravens. Ki mioki sikasin, babe. One of my favorite things about writing this book was that I got to play with Cree and put in parts of my language, and I purposely didn't translate it in the book. And it was, I wanted people who didn't speak Cree to have to fumble and sound out the words and have to get their little fingies typing on Google to try and find the translations or figure out the context clues of what these mean. And I wanted Cree speakers to see it and feel seen and know that our language can just exist and it doesn't have to be a whole teaching lesson for other people. And it has been, I think, one of the more special things about writing this book was just getting to share in that way. All right, so I got 2 more. Is that okay? Okay. How you all doing? Okay, cool. You don't have to clap. I just wanted to vibe check, see what's going on out there. And on the live stream, which I just remembered is happening, so that's great. Oh boy. Okay. Hold on. I may be changing my mind. No, we're gonna do this one. So this poem is called Wanisonowin, and it is dedicated for all our relatives that were taken too soon. With everything and writing this book and trying to encapsulate, a decade of being a messy person in their 20s who is, just live, laugh, loving in the city, we'll say, because maybe my family is watching the live stream, I don't know. And that's all the details they need. It was also coming into being and a bigger understanding of what it means to have to grieve so many people in our greater communities who are lost. And coming to Vancouver and experiencing the Women's Memorial March for the first time was just like a place of mourning, grief, and also just to hold each other that I'd never experienced before. And so I feel like a huge part of growing up, and I count in your 20s growing up because you still got a lot of lessons to learn, that was very pivotal. But this one is for all our relatives taken too soon. Here are some lies I told you today. I'm fine, it's okay. White people never understand what I mean when I say, but they're my family. Maybe it's because they grew up kicking anthills. It's not hard to mourn a stranger when these strangers aren't so different from the faces at home. I'm fine, it's okay. She laughs when I say I can smell the seasons change, but we wake up to frosty mornings caught in low sunlight. The birds know it will snow soon. The leaves are starting to point down. Autumn brings grief and the end of huckleberries. It brings longer nights and brighter moons. The northern lights are a stairway to a final home, and they've been dancing a long dance, making room in constellations for souls to rest. There's a particular heartache we feel. They probably don't feel it, but there's a particular heartache we feel when the river is being dragged, when back roads are being searched, when footprints disappear in the snow. All right, I have one more for you. I don't know why my voice is getting more and more gravelly. All right, this one's a bit longer. It's called the Lord's Prayer. We're just gonna jump into it. Just vibe with it. Help. I'm joking, it's okay. It's okay, okay. The Lord's Prayer. When we stayed at Cookum's, she'd tuck us into sleep and say the Lord's Prayer, leaning over the back of the couch, the same couch I fell off of as a toddler, broke my nose. She'd start, Our Father who art in heaven. Plagued by nightmares, each passing pile of clothes or coat hanging on the chair was a threat, a monster, some horror hiding in the corner. They'd seep into my dreams. Hallowed be thy name. Cookum's house smelled like garlic, bread, white diamonds perfume, grandpa, and must. The couch I slept on, Cookum's couch, was small with a cushion worn down where she sat. This was her spot, and I am the lucky one that gets to sleep on her couch. Thy kingdom come. My brother slept less than 5 feet away on the bigger couch, the one Grandpa would sometimes sit on to watch the news, but Grandpa spent his days in the chair on the far side of the kitchen table, playing one long game of solitaire, drinking iced tea out of a plastic measuring cup, eating pickled herring or pickled eggs, or boiling a pot of pork hocks. I don't know if you smelled pork hocks when they're boiling. Oh boy. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The day Grandpa's spirit returned home, Mom called me at 7 a.m. Phone calls before 8 a.m. and after 11 p.m. are never good. As she told me, I didn't react. I hung up, journeyed back into the dream world. A nightmare held me. I woke up ill and cried. We bought beer, a pack of cigarettes, and sat in the park before my flight home. Give us this day our daily bread. When I walked through the door of my Cookum's house, it was full of family. I couldn't look at the kitchen table, couldn't look at the worn down spot on the tablecloth, couldn't look at the ratty deck of cards sitting there untouched. Cookum was sitting in her spot, watching TV. Hi, babe, she said, not meeting my eyes. None of us cried. And forgive us for our trespasses. We spent the week preparing for his feast, cabbage rolls, bannock, potato salad to be eaten at the Friendship Center, Cree prayer before English prayer. This was as much for Cookum as it was for Grandpa. We get home and Cookum sits opposite to where Grandpa sat, grabs the ratty deck of cards, small brown hand shuffling and reshuffling grief. She starts a game of solitaire. As we forgive those who trespass against us. She looks up from her game and asks, who will I fight with now? And lead us not into temptation. A month later, I had my first experience of sleep paralysis. I lie in my bed and see something standing in the corner. I am scared and can't move, can't scream. This is the dream world entering the waking. I know this is grief coming to collect. Covered in sweat, heart beating, this thing is no longer in the corner of my room, but now I sleep with the lights on. But deliver us from evil. Last week, Grandma on the farm took the same journey as Grandpa. A nightmare greets me every night, and I wonder how many days I can stay awake. Cookum says we come from a family of dreamers. Amen. Thank you all so much.
Something I love so much about your collection was that you use such beautiful details that bring us into both these physical spaces, the river, the farm, but also like these really beautiful emotional spaces too, which I don't think we often acknowledge as being real places in writing. And I really loved your collection for that. Brandon. It's your turn now. Last but not least, Brandon holds a Bachelor of Education from the University of British Columbia with a specialization in Indigenous education and a journalism diploma from Langara College. His work has been published in the Barely South Review, the Richmond Review, and the Province. He is a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation with a mix of Indigenous and English ancestry. He resides in Richmond, BC, where he works as a TTOC. Take it away, Brandon.
Thank you. Is that on?
Can Brandon use the podium?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So good here.
Just touch it once.
Touch it once. So, I wrote this book. It's called Beautiful, Beautiful. And basically it's about a 12-year-old named Derek Mormon who travels to Bella Bella with his dad, George Mormon. And if you don't know, Bella Bella is along the central coast, basically, of BC, right? And he travels with a family friend who may or may not be a shaman. and it's predominantly, in theory, narrated by a bird. So I'm going to read to you this chapter, which I quite like, and it's called To Be a Rock and Not to Roll. So without further ado. Sometimes our thoughts are misgiven. I'm sitting here on these eggs, but if I leave for a second, a pesky squirrel may gobble them up, just as it happened to my ancestors and me. I realize squirrels need to eat, but if they stop forgetting where they buried their nuts, maybe my children could see the light of day. I do enjoy a nice worm, though, so I suppose worms don't appreciate me either. You can say it's survival of the fittest, a phrase originating in Darwinist evolutionary theory, but what's the line between what's food and what's a victim of tyranny? Charles Darwin had a half-cousin named Francis Galton, a proponent of eugenics, the set of beliefs and practices with the goal of improving genes. He theorizes artificial selection could be applied to humans as had been done to plants. Take the seeds of a tall plant and its spawn will grow tall. This is an example of positive eugenics because you're preserving positive traits. Negative eugenics involves exterminating blue plants because you don't like the color of their skin, thus eliminating negative traits. If you want blondes driving your tanks, and simply let them do all the passing on the gene. The idea is far from outlandish to animals like you and me, as we compete to breed, ensuring the strongest males pass on their genes. It's clear in this instance that strength is generally considered positive, but it's not always so easy to determine what is good and what is bad. The problem of evil is a classic theological example. If God is omnipotent and all good, and there is evil in the world, then God can't exist because surely they would stop evil things from occurring in the world. It's important to note that bad isn't always evil. Evil requires a conscious act, like murder, which isn't necessarily the case of bad. You wouldn't call an earthquake evil unless you think God did it on purpose, which may be true. Maybe God is inherently evil. Who knows? I digress. My point is, why is murder evil? Squirrels eat my eggs all the time. I wouldn't consider them evil. The squirrels are just following their primitive urge to kill my children, just like you do chickens. Chickens don't call you evil. I know, I've clucked. So why consider murder evil? Obviously, it strips someone of life. Perhaps murderers can't help it, like the determinist squirrels, heeding the murderers' voices in their heads. Or maybe the murderee gets to go on to the next life living as a Ferris wheel, full of joy and wonder. From God's cold logical system, you become the next effect along the long list of cause and effect set forth in the creation of the universe. So there really is no evil. You can also dodge the above argument entirely by taking a more indigenous perspective by ascribing God solely a creator, as we've already proved good and evil to be human perceptions. Some would say the creator is just a life force that sparked all things into being. Some may subscribe gender, but it seems agreed the creator is what started all. You can argue from here that the creator is the first cause in the chain aforementioned that brought you here, and thus impartial to our perceptions of good and evil. That God is all, and we are all a part, including sadistic squirrels, or that special right is reserved for God to be fully a part of everything, yet wholly separate is a paradox. Any of these avenues transcend good and evil, as all is just. This is relevant because Nazis thought eugenics was necessary to preserve their population by eliminating bad races, ensuring enough land and resources for the good ones. To them, it was as cold, logical, and unempathetic as the universe appears to be with cancer, murder, or natural disasters. They were squirrels who misplaced their nuts and consumed bird eggs and called all squirrels who didn't look like them. Did Nazis need to resort to such drastic measures? Most certainly not. But they could, and it made their lives easier at the expense of those they deemed subhuman, so they felt justified in their actions. Unfortunately, Canada also had its fair share of eugenical perpetrators in the medical, educational, and political fields. Ptolemy Douglas, the founder of the New Democratic Party and voted the greatest Canadian of all time as part of a CBC television series, was a supporter of sterilizing mental defectives. Another prominent Canadian eugenicist, Helen McMurtry, a pioneer in the medical field who helped prevent high infant mortality rates by standardizing such practices as the sterilization of bottles and hand washing, helped institutionalize and sterilize the feeble-minded, an archaic term for anyone with an intellectual disability. Douglas and McMurtry weren't outliers. They were two of the leading minds in their respective fields at the time. Eventually, eugenics became legislation in Canada, to the point that those with intellectual disabilities, Indigenous women, and anyone else labeled inferior were rounded up into camps and sterilized against their will, sometimes without their knowledge. One woman had her uterus carved as someone took a dozen cords from a dozen different countries, tied them in a ball, dipped them in wax, buried them, then tried charging their Tesla so she couldn't possibly breed and transfer her negative genes, which she only discovered when she went to a doctor, years later, curious as to why she couldn't get pregnant. But Redbird, says Coyote, that must have happened in the 1930s. Those eugenicists must have learned their errors of their ways. Of course, my friend. Except incidents like this occurred as recently as 2018. Such eugenic practices weren't just limited to sterilization. Blood quantum laws and residential schooling are eugenical in nature as well. If you don't know, blood quantum is the measuring of one's Indianness by analyzing one's ancestry. To qualify as a status Indian, one has to have a certain amount of Indian blood. Right away, you see the problem. What should be considered enough? To access benefits such as post-secondary funding, lax hunting and fishing rights, or tax emissions on reserve. The process is still ongoing. But gaining status was an even bigger issue decades ago, as you couldn't live on a reserve unless you had status. Indigenous women were especially affected, as they lost status if they married white men. The intent was to assimilate Indigenous people into Canadian settler society, to solve the Indian problem, and relinquish land so the government could claim it. Some would argue they stole it anyway, which is fair. If a woman lost status, she had little choice but to move to the city and take whatever work she could, which is the reason we see Indigenous people overrepresented in Vancouver's downtown east side, resorting to prostitution or other illicit activities, often to fuel drug addictions inflicted by predators. This is just one legacy of Canadian eugenic practices. Sometimes they just straight up kill children in residential schools, which is genocide. Some Indigenous, like George, were careful who they revealed their status to, due to atrocities committed against their ancestors, systemic racism, and racial prejudice. Genocide has occurred throughout history, and there's no reason to believe it won't arise again. Sometimes it's difficult to see what you're doing is bad, as words have two meanings. One's temptation may be another's undoing. All we can do is try and experience what the others are experiencing to prevent such atrocities from occurring under new guise. Everyone is doing what they believe is best, even if completely ruthless. So let's pray to see with future eyes to gain the wisdom of retrospect in hopes of maintaining peace and goodness for all. Also, please don't put me in a cage for being 2% parakeet again. So, two sort of themes running through this chapter, if you will, right? So obviously, the first one is that I wrote this during the pandemic. So really, what I was thinking in my head was that I wanted to write a story that truly expressed me and everything I'm about, which was being Indigenous, growing up Indigenous, and so forth, right? And this thought of an invisible disease that would claim me, such as COVID, was really quite a disturbing thing, because I had heard stories about my great-grandpa running away from smallpox. So this idea that my ancestors got so far to go through residential schools 2 generations ago, and then Indian day school a generation ago, I really didn't want to succumb to a disease before I told my story. So that was one aspect of it. The second aspect, obviously, is the Stairway to Heaven reference. So basically, to be a rock and not to roll is in the final verse of Stairway to Heaven, right? And in that song, there's a line, in a tree by the brook, there's a songbird that sings, sometimes all of our thoughts are misgiven. And that contradicts how the narration is going, really, this idea that you could buy your way into heaven, because the songbird is admitting that sometimes its thoughts are filled with doubts and apprehensions, right? It's realistic. And if you listen to birds, that's what they do, really, right? They say what's bad, what's good, and so forth, right? And I thought that was a beautiful realization. And I also really consider Redbird to be more of a songbird than anything. So those are the two themes really running through that chapter there. To express how I got published, my journey. Well, I wanted to, like I said, write my story. And I thought, well, you know, I want to write about the Thunderbird, really, because there's nothing more rad than the Thunderbird. So, you know, I thought about it, and then eventually it became Redbird, who sort of transforms into the Thunderbird and other mystical sort of creatures and birds, right? And, you know, that's how it worked out, really. I got Redbird, and he's sort of the beauty of Redbird is that it could look at humanity from outside perspective, right? And that's really put on display in that chapter, I would say. And then, you know, I'd heard about Nightwood, and then I really wanted to be published by Nightwood. I sent it to them. Silas White, the publisher, liked it, and then I sent more of it, and I got my wish, and I was very grateful for that. Obviously, Nightwood is part of Harbour Publishing, and they're part of Gibson's BC, so they really are located in BC, and I thought that would be best because the book primarily takes place along the coast. It's sort of a hero's voyage, which ties in the Stairway to Heaven as well. That's basically it.
I'm glad you shared one of the chapters that's from Redbird's point of view, because I think what's so unique about Brandon's novel is that we hear from Derek, but we also hear from Redbird, and it really creates this interesting perspective of what's happening in the story, and of the dualities that Brandon addresses. So definitely worth reading. Buy all 3 books afterwards. We are gearing up for the Q&A, Jorge. So if you do have a question, both at home, if you're enjoying this on your couch, or here in person, we will take your questions. So think of them now. I'll ask a question while you're all coming up with your questions. But as you are thinking of your questions, please let kindness and genuine curiosity guide you as you're coming up with your questions. I also generally like to avoid the comment disguised as a question, just because it's harder for the authors to engage with it. So try and come up with a good, solid question that they can answer. And notice I said a good, solid question, because often the 4 multi-part questions, again, I don't know, I get lost after one question. So we want them to be able to answer your question. So one question is easiest. So while you're all thinking very long and hard about your questions, I'm going to ask a question. So something I'm always very curious about is how the places that we grow up inform our art and writing. So to the 3 of you, how does where you grew up shape your approach to place and setting in your writing and art? Henry, do you want to go first?
Well, for this particular example, for White Riot, I didn't know about the anti-Asian riots in 1907 until my probably mid-20s or so. And when I did come across it, I really don't know where I came across it, but I remember being surprised that it had never been brought up before. I went to school here, I went to post-secondary here, and I had to kind of stumble across it. When I was growing up, I didn't know about the Indian Act. I didn't know about the Komagatameru. I didn't know about Japanese-Canadian internment, because they weren't considered important enough to tell our kids about. So I didn't grow up with that. So things have changed since then. Things haven't changed completely. A lot of these topics are still optional in the social studies classes. There are required topics, but 1907 anti-Asian riots aren't. And even though you might be going to school where the rioters trampled through in the neighborhood, it's still not absolutely required. It's kind of funny, right? I mean, we're here basically, was this on the route? I think it might have been on the route. Yeah, this might have been on the route, this very place. Because it started off at Beatty Street Drill Hall, which is where the Vancouver Art Gallery is currently digging a hole. And the parade went north to Hastings and then hung a right and then went to Carnegie Center, and right next door was Market Hall, where City Hall used to be, right? And then the riot broke out. So I think this might have been pretty much on the path, but certainly there would have been people waving banners and rule Britannia, White Canada Forever, that kind of stuff. We didn't learn about white nationalism, except we did. We ingested all that, right? That was the norm. The attitudes of the time, and the attitudes still persist. I mean, we still have some king on our coin, a coin coming up. The colonial history here was never couched as anything beyond just normal. So, what does it take to try to uncover that normalcy and the presumptions of the power structure and to raise questions around it? I think that's part of our jobs as artists, to raise questions, no matter, however one does that. And it could be indirect, or it could be confrontational or whatever. I don't like the confrontational aspect, but I think I chose a title that some people find confrontational, but it's just trying to be accurate. Right? So I don't know if that directly answered your question.
I think so. Brandon, do you want to go next?
So what was the original question? Sorry. About place.
Was how does where you grew up shape your approach to place and setting in your writing and art?
Well, obviously I grew up in Richmond, so it's like surrounded by the rivers and stuff. And there's always this idea. Well, it's Steeston, right, which is historical fishing village, right, where I think most of the fishing fleet was for Canada. I think something like that. It was a huge fishing fleet. My dad worked for there. So I got to see really like the change of Steeston from like a boardwalk town to like, you know, a trendy sort of place to be with boardwalks and stuff like that. So there was a big change. And it was also an interesting mix between like urbanization and then like rural places. Like you could still sort of get lost in like Hunter's Trail and stuff like that along the dike. And I like that juxtaposition, the beauty of it, but also the urbanization of it. And yeah, it was a very beautiful place to grow up, very multicultural. One of the main things that I try and do in the book is talk about like all sort of beliefs, right? And I grew up on what's called the Highway to Heaven, I think it's called, right? Because there's a loophole. I tell this story too much, but no, I'm into it. So like, there's a loophole, I think, where if you have farmland, you could build whatever you want on the farm. So like, people bought up farms and they built like religious institutions. So if you go along this road, it's just like religious institution after religious institution, right? And it's from all over the world, and it was a very inspirational thing. So I always tried to see people's perspectives and sort of mend them into my own. And that's why I sort of consider myself more of a worldly figure. And I guess, you know, Redbird is sort of that, right? Because they're outside looking in. They're looking at humanity in general. And they're sort of unbiased in that respect. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Well,
Sam? Me? Yes.
Oh boy. I think for me, where I grew up is also just as important as where I didn't grow up. And so because I was, or not me, but my family for various reasons was displaced from our home community, from Alacross or from Sigitawak when my kukum moved away and moved to the Peace region. That's how my mom and dad met, and then that's how me and my brother got here. So I often think about how there had to be so many things that happened for us to get here, and how the Peace, it really is the place I call home the most, but Alacross or Sigitawak is the place where my kin for generations immemorial have lived and died. And so I think of it as a home I didn't grow up in, as a home I don't know, but as a home I know by name and I know by stories that I've been told, and memories I have from visiting when I was really little. I actually have a really hard time answering this question because I can't pick out how these places have inspired me or been a part of, you know, my writing, because they're a part of me and I'm a part of them, and I can't pick out, like, I don't know where I wouldn't be here without the Peace region and without Alacross. And so I don't even really think of like, this was an inspiration or something I did consciously. I can't not write about them.
Thank you. All right, we're ready for your questions if you want to raise your hand. Everyone's looking at each other with that, like, is it going to be you first or you first? We do have some questions that have come from our online audience. So maybe we'll start there. Henry, we have a question for you. How do you do the layers of historical documents and architecture in the VR walk? How did you decide what to include? Did you write a script first and then utilize the added visual materials or the script around the visual materials?
Oh, okay, great. A question about the art part, which is really nice. Okay, so these are 360 photographs, and I don't know if you ever... Sorry. Okay, so I think the question is about embedding the archival photographs onto the 360 photographs that were taken back in 2019. I basically try to find as many old pictures and documents that were related to this topic, and we painstakingly colorized all of them, which was challenging because we didn't know what color certain buildings were or what color certain clothes were for that person wearing, that outfit. The sky was easy, but we just optimistically chose blue, even though in Vancouver it's not always blue. Telephone poles, I think they looked the same back then. But we went for some of the buildings. There's a Vancouver Heritage Foundation has a color palette for old houses, and so we referred to that. So a lot of the buildings actually had the same kind of colors. It was really challenging trying to figure out exactly where this building is currently. In some cases, it was pretty obvious. There's a strip along Powell Street that's really challenging because you got all these really ugly concrete and brick buildings replaced because they tore that whole neighborhood up after the Japanese got taken away. So that was really tough. For me, it's kind of interesting just looking at this imagery now, because since 2019 and today, Oppenheimer Park no longer has the tent city. But it's interesting that historically Oppenheimer Park was designated by the city, I think around early 1900s, as the one place where demonstrations could happen. Public congregation for demonstrations. And it's sort of interesting they chose that area because it was a working class neighborhood. It wasn't in the nice areas of town. And it's also a place where the police could contain the demonstrations. The other interesting image I'm finding since 2019 is the very first stop, which is directly overlooking the Gassy Jack statue, which no longer exists. So, and many of you will know that it was torn down during one of the Women's March, last year's Women's March? Yeah, sort of a surprise teardown. So as this project ages, and I don't know how long it'll stay on the internet, and that's the problem with anything on the internet. There's going to be obsolescence and it's not going to run anymore on the operating system. It itself is a historical document, even though it's only 5 years old. Is that enough?
I think that's enough.
Okay, good. That's a lot of words.
Audience? Have we peer pressured each other into in the front, yes.
I have a question for Sam. Could you tell us about your writing process?
I'm just going to repeat it for our online folks. Sam, can you tell us about your writing process?
Yeah. So, like any millennial, I had a blog because it was the early 2010s. And I thought, everyone else has a blog, I should have a blog too. And so a lot of these poems lived in various states on a blog. It was called A Half-Breed's Reasoning, like a tongue-in-cheek kind of nod to E. Pauline Johnson's A Red Girl's Reasoning. And my writing process is, I wish I had like a cool craft. Like, this is my cool writing craft. But honestly, a lot of these poems have existed in notes on my phone or just scribbled in notebooks. And I find that, especially now because, I work full time and everything, that writing happens when it happens, and I have to just when I want to, or when I have something that's just burning in my mind, that's when I do it. And so honestly, a lot of poems just exist on my notes app on my phone. And then eventually get polished. But yeah, the ones in this book are on the blog, and then they've been edited and re-edited to oblivion, which I'm very thankful for, because that blog deserves to stay in 2010.
You don't like sit down and write like purposefully? It's just like inspiration. You sit down.
No, I have ADHD. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you mind if I just stand up? So I can
Yeah.
Yeah. This is just a question
Oh.
for, I think Harry, right?
Henry.
My bad. So like, yeah, I'm in a like, my sister married someone from a Chinese background, and anti-Asian sentiment kind of hits home for me. So, like, I don't know, like, this is like a year ago or something like that. There's a blog that said that like Vancouver was voted the most anti-Asian city, just on per capita hate crimes. When it comes to like understanding your research with the riots and how the city is now, how like, is the continuity still there? Is it still pretty present? And how does that how does those bigoted sentiments still arise kind of today, and how does it also relate back to the past, at least with your research? Hopefully my question's not too convoluted.
I'm trying to think of how to sum it up, but I think if I'm paraphrasing correctly, it's how does that anti-Asian sentiment that you found in your research for the riot walks, how does that look today? Is that kind of it?
Oh no, basically.
Okay.
Okay, maybe I'll put it into a certain kind of context. So when British Columbia entered Confederation back in, I think, 1871, is that the right date? One of the very first acts that the legislature passed was to take away the vote from Indigenous and Chinese people. And I saw a list of all the different acts that were racially targeting Indigenous, Chinese, and then when more Japanese came, Japanese, and also South Asians. And I just picked an arbitrary date, 1900, because it's a nice round number. So between 1871 and 1900, I counted 88 different acts that were targeting, mostly it was Chinese Indigenous at first, and then increasingly more others, right? To take away the right to work in certain industries, rights to vote in this area, that area, and so forth. It's just amazing. And so when we look at anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian racism in BC, and there's also anti-Jew and anti-Muslim, that's more of a recent thing, although Muslims were here earlier on than most people realize. There's a filmmaker, Ali Kazemi, in Toronto, who's been working on a documentary about a Punjabi Muslim, early worker here, I think around turn of the century. So, it's not a surprise that there are these attitudes, because it was actually really common amongst, it was certain white people back then. And it had been happening, there was agitation happening for many decades, ever since the gold rush, when different people came from around the world to try to strike it rich, from Mexico, California, and on up. So when people are surprised that racism rears its ugly head, well, it's because racism has a deep root in this part of the world. Racism has a deep root everywhere. It's just site-specific. It just reflects the biases and the prejudices of the local people and whoever has more power than other people. So we have a certain kind of, white nationalist racism here, but there are different nationalisms and racisms and attitudes all over the place. So that's kind of a larger context answer. And COVID just gave certain people they felt they had the right to lash out at who they thought were causing the problem of them not being able to to go into a restaurant with a mask or something like that.
Thank you. And I think we have room for one more. Yeah.
I'm just interested for Brandon, given your question to Sam, what's your writing process?
I'm just going to repeat it quickly.
Oh, sure.
The question is for Brandon. What is your writing process?
I sit in the dark by the dryer.
Is the dryer on?
Yeah, that's why I sit by it.
Okay. Is that because the dryer is warm?
A little bit. It's mostly the white noise, you know. Helps me sort of focus. That's really it. I mean, I try and like write, you know, I do sit down like day after day, 6 days a week or something, and try and write 2,000 words. Nowadays, I try and write like a scene. I try and change it up though. Maybe I'll scribble like with inspiration in the car or something. And sometimes those are like the best bits. So just try and stay creative with it. But yeah, you know, there's, I think it's equally about harboring inspiration and then just like working on your craft. Craft sort of carries you through when inspiration fails, is what I usually say, right? There.
Wow, that's impressive.
Just go to the laundromat.
It helps. Yeah.
Go to the laundromat, turn all the lights off. It's fine. All right, I'm going to leave us with one last question, bringing us back to our general theme of place. As we've seen in all of your works, place marks and impacts us in so many ways. It creates unanswered questions, deep longings, feelings of displacement. These questions, of course, can sometimes only be answered in art and writing. How has your work helped you with your own ideas of place and space? And Sam, you're going first this time.
That is a tough one. That's a really great question. I think for me, there was, grief is such a prominent part of this book. And it's also just a prominent part of my life. It's a prominent part of all our lives. And a big thing of writing this, this book was almost a way to say, not goodbye, but a way to process and grow and kind of hold my younger self as Sam from Dawson Creek, and being that, you know, teenager and 20-year-old that moved here and was having all these experiences and going through such a big change in my life, and it now is this capsule that communicates what that was like, all the experiences, and really a love song to the North, but also a love song to getting to live here on the coast now and trying to be here in a good way and walk in a good way and make good relationships here. And I think now one of my bigger learnings is trying to understand how I, as an Indigenous person, can live respectfully and with humility in someone else's home, and all the complexities that holds. And it's not neat and tidy, and it's uncomfortable, and it makes me feel weird, and it honestly should. I feel like living on someone else's territory, we're complicit in someone else's displacement, and that shouldn't make us feel comfortable. And I think there's a lot of good learning and a lot of good growing that comes when we embrace that discomfort and we sit in that discomfort. And so the places we are our biggest teachers, and I'm just very thankful for that.
Brendan?
Well, I guess like when I first wrote it, like I really focused like on Vancouver and this idea that I was going to move to like a more rural area and it was going to be all good and stuff. But I you know, writing I think really is like a healing journey sort of thing, right? So I learned to appreciate Vancouver for what it is. And also Bella Bella for what it is, right? I mean, it's a tough place to live, really. It's gloomy, it's dark, it's stormy. There's a lot of history to it. So it's really, me through writing, I came to respect both of these different cities. It's almost like a tale of two cities, right? Charles Dickens or something like that. Yeah, so, you know, I learned to appreciate it, really, and you could see that in the drafts. Like, it started sort of vindictive and maybe violent or revolutionary in a lot of ways, and then I sort of learned to accept more than anything, and healed, I guess.
Henry?
Oh, sorry, I thought the question was for them. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. How has your work helped you with your own ideas of place and space?
Well, there's a lot of research that I underwent for the art project, and it was really irritating when, like, some people called me a historian, because I'm not a historian. I have too much respect for people who've done all that work and they're experts, right? So, but I've done certain research for the project, and for any time you start digging into any kind of topic, what's beautiful is that you start to find out how to ask more questions, because until you start figuring out what it is to ask, you don't even know to ask it about it. So there's this kind of unfolding and unearthing and expanding, and the more that you see, the more you realize you don't know, and opens up other doors for other kind of avenues to explore. And so it's beautiful but frustrating, because you always feel inadequate, and it's just so much more there, and you don't have so much time. So I guess that's the case for all my projects. This is just one of various directions that I go in for my art practice. So, but it's it's something that, and also it's kind of odd. Well, anyways, it's so hyper local, and sometimes I wonder whether or not the specificities can operate on a level that resonates into other kind of situations and places where people can identify with their own experiences, and then it can become more of a metaphor for a certain kind of condition. I don't know. That's, of course, I think everyone's hope, that when they write about something in particular, it can be more than just that one thing, right? That this is a condition that you're describing for someone else to connect with and take away and find their own path through what you provided.
Thank you. Well, I think we will leave it there. Let's give our authors a round of applause. I want to again thank the Vancouver Public Library. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Black Bond Books and Book Warehouse. That's your plug again. Go buy books. I want to invite you also to please visit our BC and Yukon Book Prizes website, where you can find out all the information about all our finalists. We give out 8 book prizes a year. Each prize has 5 finalists, so there are many other books you need to buy, is what I'm telling you. Also, we do a weekly podcast, which will be starting on June 1st. We work to, over the year, feature an interview with every shortlisted author. So these folks here will be featured eventually. Yes, you will. That's okay. And we also have more upcoming events. There is an event with Michael Nicol-Yachlanis and Sam George at Massey Arts Gallery. That's coming up on June 20th. It's a free event. You just need to RSVP online. And if you happen to find yourself in Victoria next week, we're doing an event at Monroe's Books with Daryl McLeod, Chelsea Wakelin, and David Norwell. So lots more finalist events coming up, and online stuff too, so keep an eye out on our website. Thanks again to all of you for joining us.